The silence in our booth was a thing of substance, a heavy velvet curtain that had dropped between us and the rest of the world, muffling the distant, happy clinking of other people's lives. It was a tangible presence, settling into the space where conversation should have been, wrapping itself around the stems of the half-empty wine glasses and clinging to the pristine white linen of the tablecloth. We were an island in a sea of murmuring diners, a perfectly composed portrait of a man and his beautiful companion. Yet the air between Dante Volkov and myself was so charged with unspoken things it felt difficult to breathe. He owned this place, not in the legal sense that involved deeds and paperwork, but in the far more absolute way a king owns his court. The maitre d's gaze would skate past our secluded corner as if it were protected by an invisible wall, and the waiters, masters of silent deference, moved with a liquid grace that ensured they were never seen unless summoned by the barest flicker of his eyes. It wasn't his silence that terrified me, for I had grown accustomed to the weight of it over the past 3 months, but rather the quality of this particular silence, the way it had descended so abruptly. A sudden and total cessation of the low, rumbling monologue he'd been delivering about a new acquisition in the port districts. He had been speaking, and I had been listening, or at least performing the act of listening, my head tilted at the correct angle, my expression one of serene interest, a mask I had perfected. And then it happened. It wasn't a sob, not even a sniffle, nothing so overt or vulgar. It was simply a single, traitorous bead of heat that gathered in the corner of my eye, detaching itself from my control and tracing a tiny, scalding river down my temple into my hairline. I had felt its path like a brand, a microscopic betrayal that screamed of a weakness I could not afford. My hand, holding a now empty water goblet, had risen with what I prayed was casual grace, my napkin dabbing at my skin under the pretense of patting my lips. It was a swift, seamless motion, and for one fragile, hopeful second, I believed I had gotten away with it, that the dim, forgiving light of the restaurant had conspired to keep my secret. I was wrong. Dante's words had not just paused, they had vanished, sheared off mid-sentence, and now he was simply watching me, his stillness a terrifying counterpoint to the frantic, silent screaming in my own mind. His eyes, the color of wet obsidian in the candlelight, were not angry or curious, but held an unnerving, predatory focus, like a hawk that has spotted the minute tremble of a field mouse in the tall grass from a mile away. The world seemed to shrink until it consisted only of this booth, this polished mahogany table, and the unbearable weight of his gaze. Time stretched and warped, each tick of the ornate clock on the far wall a separate, distinct lifetime of dread. When he finally broke, the stillness. His voice was not the weapon I had anticipated, not a crack of thunder, but a low, velvet rumble that slid across the table and seemed to vibrate deep in my bones, a sound so intimate it felt like a violation in this public space. "Tell me why you cried." My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether. The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly impossible to answer. All the polite deflections, the practiced social evasions I might have offered another man, died in my throat. This was not a question from a concerned dinner companion. It was a demand for entry into the last place I had any sovereignty, the locked and barred fortress of my own mind. I opened my mouth, a lie already forming on my tongue, some dismissive nonsense about being tired or moved by the music, a flimsy shield to hold up against him. But before a single sound could escape, he leaned forward just an inch, a subtle shift in posture that nonetheless felt like a tectonic event, his presence consuming the very air I needed to speak. His power was a physical force, pressing down on me, suffocating me. "And do not lie to me, Golubka," he murmured, the Russian endearment, his little dove, sounding more like a brand than a term of affection. "I will know." He settled back into the plush leather of the booth. A king returned to his throne, the picture of serene patience. But there was a promise in his eyes, a vow of unending, relentless scrutiny. He had me pinned, not with his hands, but with his will. A silent decree passed between us, a contract written in the charged atmosphere. He was not just telling me I couldn't leave the table. He was telling me that this entire restaurant, with its crystal chandeliers and hushed opulence, had just become my cage. The smiling diners, the silent waiters, the city lights glittering through the tall windows, they were all just scenery in the interrogation room he had built for me. We would sit here all night if we had to. Two figures frozen in a tableau of quiet warfare, until I surrendered the one thing I still considered my own, the truth of my sorrow. This was no longer a dinner. It was a siege, and he was demanding the unconditional surrender of my soul, right here in the heart of his gilded world, starting with the reason for a single, solitary tear. The pressure of his demand was a physical thing, a crushing weight that seemed to warp the very air in our booth, making the candlelight flicker and dance as if in a gale. My mind, a frantic creature caught in a trap, scrabbled for an escape route, a plausible lie, a half-truth, anything that would satisfy the predator across the table without forcing me to slice myself open and offer him the bleeding, vital organs of my memory. Around us, the restaurant continued its symphony of civilized life, a world of polite laughter and the gentle scrape of silver on porcelain, a universe so alien and distant from the silent, brutal war being waged in our small corner that I felt a dizzying sense of dislocation, as if I were watching it all through a thick pane of soundproof glass. I was a performer on a brightly lit stage, the spotlight of his attention holding me mercilessly in place, and my only role was to maintain a facade of calm composure while my insides were being methodically disassembled by the sheer force of his will. The phantom weight of 100 imagined stares pricked at my skin, each one a silent judgment on the woman who sat with Dante Volkov, the woman who was so clearly his possession. And this public scrutiny transformed his quiet interrogation into a profound and layered humiliation. Summoning a sliver of defiance from the depths of my terror, I manufactured a small, tired smile, a fragile and surely unconvincing thing, and let out a soft sigh that I hoped sounded genuine. "It's nothing, really," I murmured, my voice a strained whisper as I allowed my gaze to drift toward the orchestra playing softly on a distant dais, anywhere but at him. "I'm just tired, and the music is a little melancholy, that's all." The lie felt like ash in my mouth, a pathetic little shield of reeds held up against a battering ram, and I knew, even as I spoke the words, that he would see right through them, that my attempt at deflection was as transparent as the crystal of the wineglass my trembling fingers were now gripping. His reaction was not a flash of anger or an accusatory outburst, but something far more unnerving. A deep, profound stillness settled over his features, and a shadow of something that looked like cold amusement, or perhaps disappointment, flickered in the depths of his obsidian eyes. He didn't even grant my lie the dignity of a verbal rebuttal, simply shaking his head once, a slow, deliberate motion that was a complete and utter dismissal of my effort, a gesture that told me I had not only failed, but that he had expected me to. The truth I was so desperately trying to protect was, in itself, a ghost, a phantom that had ambushed me with the unexpectedness of a sudden fever. It was the wine, a specific vintage of Chianti he had ordered with a casual flourish, its name spoken to the sommelier like an incantation. And with the first sip, the carefully constructed walls I had built around my past had been washed away in a tide of crimson memory. I was no longer in a chic, metropolitan restaurant, but back in the sun-drenched kitchen of my childhood home, the air thick with the scent of garlic and my mother's baking bread. My father, a man whose hands were more accustomed to ledgers than wine bottles, was proudly pouring that exact same deep, earthy red into 3 glasses, his face alight with a rare, unburdened joy. One for him, one for my mother, and a small symbolic measure for me, to celebrate my full scholarship to the university. And then Leo, my younger brother, all lanky limbs and irrepressible energy at 16, had snuck into the kitchen and, when my father's back was turned, had stolen a sip from his glass, his handsome face contorting into a mask of comical disgust that had made me choke on my own laughter. It was the last, perfect memory, a snapshot of a life that no longer existed, a life before the debts, before the fear, before the fire that had stolen Leo's laughter from the world forever, and had ultimately led me to this very table, a final living payment for my father's ruin. That single tear had not been for the woman I was now, but for the girl I had been, and for the brother whose bright, beautiful future had been extinguished like a candle in a storm. "No," Dante said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing me to lean in slightly to hear him, a subtle manipulation that brought me further into his orbit. It wasn't the music. He began his true interrogation then, not with accusations, but with a series of quiet, surgical questions, each one a delicate probe searching for a weakness in my defenses. His words were whispers, intimate and unnervingly soft, so that to any casual observer we would look like lovers sharing secrets across the candlelight. "Tell me about the garden at your family home," he murmured, his gaze never leaving mine. "You had roses, didn't you? Your mother planted them." My blood ran cold. How could he know that? It was such a small, insignificant detail, a piece of my life I had never shared with anyone in this new, dark world. He continued, his questions weaving a tapestry of my past that he had no right to possess, asking about my father's preference for French literature, about the name of the dog we'd had when I was a child, each piece of knowledge a quiet, brutal demonstration that my entire history was an open book to him. I felt flayed, my skin peeled back layer by layer, the cherished privacy of my memories violated and exposed right here, under the warm glow of the chandeliers, by a man who had purchased my present and was now claiming ownership of my past as well. Just as the pressure began to feel truly unbearable, a potential savior appeared in the form of our waiter, a tall, thin man with a professionally blank expression, who materialized beside our table to ask if we were ready for dessert. A surge of desperate hope shot through me. This was an interruption, a break in the tension, a chance to reset the suffocating dynamic. I looked at the waiter with an intensity that must have been unnerving, willing him to stay, to ask us 100 questions about soufflé and sorbet. But Dante didn't even turn his head. He simply lifted his left hand, a barely perceptible gesture, a flick of his fingers that was both an order and a threat. The waiter's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his features before the professional mask slammed back into place, and he simply nodded once and vanished as silently as he had arrived. The hope in my chest curdled into despair. Dante's control was absolute, not just over me, but over every single person in this building. He had dismissed the outside world with the ease of a god swatting a fly, leaving me once again alone on our island, utterly and completely at his mercy. He watched my reaction, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips for the first time that night. A smile that held no warmth, only the grim satisfaction of a predator enjoying the fear of its prey. He had seen the hope in my eyes and had taken a savage pleasure in extinguishing it. He leaned forward again, the space between us shrinking, his presence an intoxicating, terrifying mix of expensive cologne and raw power. He knew he was winning, that my defenses were crumbling under the relentless, psychological assault. I braced myself for the final, killing blow, for the question that would finally shatter me, the demand to know about Leo, about the fire, about the true source of the grief that lived in my bones. I steeled myself for the pain of it, for the ultimate violation. But instead, he shifted his strategy. And what he did next was so unexpected, so completely disarming, that it terrified me more than any direct question ever could. The intense interrogator's focus in his eyes softened, replaced by something more contemplative, more insidious. He settled back in his seat, swirling the dark red wine in his glass, and the hunter became a storyteller. "You value your grief," he stated, not a question but a quiet observation. "You guard it like a treasure. Let me tell you a story about something I once lost. A story about a starving wolf cub I found in the snows outside St. Petersburg." His shift in his tactics was so abrupt and unnerving that it left me momentarily breathless, the carefully constructed walls of my defiance wavering under the sheer unpredictability of his assault. I had been braced for a direct attack, for the final, brutal question that would force the truth from me. But instead, he had withdrawn his claws, sheathing them in the velvet glove of a shared confidence, a gesture of intimacy so calculated and artificial that it felt colder than any threat. His voice, now stripped of its demanding edge, took on a low, mesmerizing cadence as he began to speak, the tale unfolding in the hushed space between us, while the distant symphony of the restaurant played on, an oblivious soundtrack to my private undoing. He spoke of the Russian winter, painting a picture of a landscape so vast and white it erased the horizon, a place of brutal, quiet beauty where survival was a daily, bloody battle. He described finding the wolf cub, a small, shivering scrap of gray fur half buried in a snowdrift, its mother likely lost to a hunter's trap, or a harsher winter predator, its tiny whimpers almost swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the forest. I listened, my own fear momentarily held in abeyance by the stark, bleak imagery of his story, a dark fairy tale spun just for me, in the heart of this glittering, civilized cage. He recounted, with a strange and unsettling detachment, how he, a boy no older than 12, had carried the half-frozen creature back to his family's dacha, smuggling it into the warmth of the stables and nursing it with stolen milk and scraps of meat from the kitchen. He spoke of the fragile bond that had formed between the boy and the wild animal, of the soft vulnerability he had witnessed in a creature born to be a killer, and of the flicker of hope he had felt that he could somehow cheat nature, that he could save this one small life from the brutal indifference of the world. There was no sentimentality in his telling, no plea for sympathy, only a flat, factual recitation of events, yet the underlying current of a boy's desperate, lonely need was undeniably present, a ghost haunting the edges of his narrative. The tale was a calculated move, a precisely aimed weapon designed to bypass my defenses and strike at a deeper, more vulnerable part of me. He wasn't just telling me a story. He was showing me a piece of his own fractured past, offering up a shard of his own darkness as a strange, twisted form of communion, a strategic performance of empathy designed to make me feel seen, to make me believe that this monster, this captor, was the only one in the world who could possibly understand the shape of my own sorrow. The hours bled into one another, measured not by the hands of the clock on the wall, but by the emptying of the wine bottle and the slow, methodical unraveling of my composure. Other diners cast curious, lingering glances our way as they departed, their nights ending while mine seemed to have become a timeless, unending ordeal. A single, looping moment of silent confrontation. The restaurant began to empty, the staff moving with quiet efficiency to clear the surrounding tables, their movements creating a wider and wider circle of isolation around our booth, leaving us even more starkly alone in the cavernous, dimming room. His patience was a terrifying, inhuman thing. A placid, endless sea against which my frantic, desperate struggles were but a foolish ripple. He did not need to raise his voice or issue threats. He simply waited, his stillness a more potent form of torture than any physical violence, a silent testament to the fact that he had all the time in the world, and I had nowhere left to run. The climax of his story arrived with the same chilling lack of emotion as its beginning. He described how, after a week of careful nursing, the wolf cub had regained its strength, its wild instincts beginning to surface, And one morning, he had found its mother, a huge, scarred she-wolf with pale, hungry eyes, pacing restlessly just beyond the tree line. In a moment of childish hope, he had carried the cub out, placing it in the snow for its mother to reclaim. But the she-wolf, smelling the scent of man, of civilization and domesticity, on her offspring, had merely stared at the cub, with cold, alien eyes before turning and vanishing back into the forest, rejecting it, leaving it to a certain death in the unforgiving wilderness. Some things, Dante concluded, his voice a soft, final pronouncement as he set his wineglass down with a quiet click. Once they are touched by a world they do not belong to, can never go back. They are broken in a way that cannot be fixed. The parable hung in the air between us, its meaning as clear and sharp as a shard of ice. He wasn't just talking about a wolf cub. He was talking about me, about my grief, about the way my past had irrevocably broken my present. He was telling me that he understood that fundamental brokenness, and in that shared understanding, he was forging a terrible, unbreakable link between us. That final, bleak sentence was the key that unlocked me. The story, with its cold, hard truth, pierced the last of my defenses, leaving me raw and exposed. The sheer, suffocating weight of my exhaustion, both physical and emotional, pressed down on me. And I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that I could not fight him anymore. The battle was over. He had won. My voice, when it finally emerged, was a sound I barely recognized. A choked, fragile whisper that was swallowed almost immediately by the vast silence of the nearly empty restaurant. It was a memory, I confessed, the words feeling like a physical tearing inside my chest, a surrender so complete it left me hollow. Of someone I lost. It was a crumb, a pathetically small piece of the whole, devastating truth. But it was a beginning. It was an admission of defeat. A flicker of something dark and possessive, a glint of triumph ignited in the depths of his eyes. He had his first thread, the first crack in the wall, and we both knew he would not stop pulling until the entire fortress had crumbled to dust. He held my gaze for a long, silent moment, a king accepting the fealty of a conquered subject, before giving a slow, deliberate nod. Then, with an abruptness that left me dizzy, he calmly placed a stack of $100 bills on the table, more than enough to cover the bill and the silence he had purchased, stood, and extended his hand to me. "Let's go." The release from the suffocating pressure of the booth was so sudden, so jarring, that I felt a wave of vertigo. To the few remaining staff, he was the perfect gentleman, concluding a long, intimate dinner. But I knew the truth. I was his prisoner, and he had just successfully concluded the first stage of my interrogation. The transition from the oppressive intimacy of the restaurant booth to the sterile silence of the chauffeured car was a dizzying, dreamlike shift, a movement from one gilded cage to another. The city slid past the tinted windows in a blur of fractured light and urban color, a vibrant, living world that felt a million miles away from the cold, airless bubble in which Dante and I existed. He did not speak a single word to me during the entire journey. A silence that was somehow more damning than his earlier interrogation, for it was the silence of a victor, the quiet, contemplative aftermath of a successful campaign. I sat rigid against the plush leather seat, my hands clenched in my lap, feeling utterly stripped bare, my small, whispered confession echoing in my mind like a death knell. He had taken a piece of me back there, a small, insignificant crumb of my pain, and yet it felt as though he had carved out my heart and held it in his hand, examining it with a dispassionate, predatory curiosity before tucking it away for later study. The humiliation was a hot, coiling thing in my stomach, a snake of shame that mingled with the cold dread of what was to come, because I knew with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning of his excavation of my soul. His penthouse was a testament to a very specific kind of power, a sprawling, minimalist expanse of glass and steel and shadow perched high atop the city, a sterile fortress in the sky, where the view itself was the primary decoration. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the main living area, presenting a breathtaking, panoramic vista of the glittering urban sprawl below. A carpet of jewels laid at our feet. It was the view of a king surveying his domain. And as I walked into the vast, silent space, I felt the crushing weight of my own insignificance, the nauseating realization that I was just one more beautiful, broken object he had collected to adorn his life. The lock on the door to the suite he had assigned me made no sound when it engaged, a silent, magnetic mechanism that was far more sinister than any traditional bolt. A quiet, constant reminder that while I had the illusion of privacy, I was a prisoner, as surely as if I were bound in chains. I spent the rest of the night in a state of suspended animation, too agitated to sleep, too exhausted to think, simply staring out at the indifferent city lights and feeling the ghostly echo of his victory settling into my bones. The following day, I became a phantom in his home, a silent observer drifting through the starkly beautiful, soulless rooms, trying to make myself as small and unnoticeable as possible. He largely ignored me, moving through his day with a focused, implacable purpose, taking calls in hushed, guttural Russian, and meeting with men whose tailored suits did little to hide the inherent violence in their posture. It was in the late afternoon that I inadvertently witnessed the stark, terrifying duality of his nature, the seamless transition from the patient, psychological tormentor to the cold, brutal dawn. I had been reading in a small alcove off the main living area, partially hidden by a towering piece of modern sculpture, when he took a business call, his back to me as he paced in front of the vast wall of windows. I assumed he thought I was in my room, for the carefully controlled mask of civility he wore in my presence dropped away entirely, his voice losing its velvet undertones and hardening into something sharp and cold, like chips of ice. I could not understand the rapid-fire Russian, but the tone was unmistakable, a language of pure, undiluted authority and lethal displeasure. The conversation was brief and clipped, ending with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. A short time later, one of his subordinates, a barrel-chested man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, was shown into the penthouse, his face pale and slick with a nervous sweat. He stood before Dante like a sinner before a wrathful god, delivering his report in a low, trembling voice. I could not hear the words, only the dreadful, pleading cadence of his speech. Dante listened with that same terrifying stillness I had experienced at the restaurant, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When the man had finished, there was a long, terrible silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity. The shift in Dante's demeanor, when it came, was instantaneous and absolute. The calm, patient man who had spent hours coaxing a single secret from me vanished, and in his place stood a creature of pure, cold rage. He didn't shout or yell. He simply spoke 2 words in a voice so devoid of heat, it was like the touch of frost. Then he gestured for the man to follow him into his study, a room with a heavy, soundproofed door that closed with a soft, final thud. I remained frozen in my hiding place. My blood turned to ice water in my veins, every nerve ending screaming at me to run, to hide, to somehow make myself disappear. I didn't see the violence, but I heard it. It was not a prolonged or dramatic event, just a single, sickeningly wet thud, a sound that was immediately followed by the sharp crack of bone. It was a sound of brutal, efficient finality. A few minutes later, the study door opened, and 2 other men, their faces grim and impassive, emerged, carrying the subordinate between them. He was not dead, but he was broken, his body limp and his face a mask of blood and agony. They carried him away without a word, and Dante emerged from the study a moment later, straightening the cuffs of his immaculate shirt, his expression as calm and undisturbed as if he had just concluded a mundane business transaction. The shocking contrast between the monster who ruled his empire with such casual, terrifying brutality and the man who had sat across from me, fixated on the genesis of a single tear, created a profound and horrifying dissonance in my mind. It made his intimate, personal interest in my sorrow feel infinitely more dangerous, a unique and twisted obsession that separated me from the rest of his disposable world, marking me for a fate that I was beginning to suspect might be far more complex and far more terrible than a simple, clean death. Several days later, after the chilling echo of the violence I had overheard had somewhat subsided into a low, constant hum of fear in the back of my mind, Dante sought me out in the cavernous living area where I had taken to spending my afternoons staring at the city below, a silent vigil of my own captivity. He approached me not with the predatory focus of our dinner, but with a cool, proprietary air, as if he were assessing a recent acquisition for its suitability. His announcement, when it came, was delivered with the same dispassionate finality he used for his business dealings, a statement of fact that allowed for no possibility of refusal or debate. We would be attending a dinner that evening with a rival family, the Falcones, a name I recognized with a jolt of alarm from the hushed, fragmented conversations I had overheard between his men. It was not a request, not an invitation, but a command, a clear and unequivocal decree that I was to be a part of his public performance, a beautiful, silent prop to be displayed on his arm. My role in this dangerous theatrical production was implicitly, crushingly clear. I was to look beautiful. I was to say nothing of substance, and most importantly, I was to belong to him so completely and obviously that no one in that room would dare to question his ownership. The preparations for the evening felt like the ritualistic adorning of a sacrificial lamb, each step orchestrated by him with a meticulous, unnerving attention to detail. A dress was delivered to my suite, a sheath of blood-red silk that clung to my body like a second skin, its color both a warning and a promise, a vibrant slash of life against the pale canvas of my fear. He had chosen it himself, a fact relayed to me by the silent maid who helped me into it, and the knowledge that his eyes had personally selected this garment, this armor for the battle ahead, felt like an intimate, unwelcome touch. Diamonds, cold and heavy against my throat and wrists, were produced from a velvet-lined box, their fiery brilliance feeling less like a gift and more like a beautifully wrought set of shackles, a glittering declaration of my worth and my status as his property. As I stared at my reflection in the full-length mirror, seeing a stranger with haunted eyes and a scarlet mouth, I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if my soul were floating somewhere near the ceiling, watching this costumed doll being prepared for a performance she had not rehearsed and did not understand. The woman in the mirror was a warrior queen, but I, the girl inside, was a terrified captive being led into the heart of the snake pit. The restaurant was the Falcones' territory, a stark and deliberate contrast to the refined elegance of the establishment where Dante had first dissected my soul. This place was louder, flashier, a symphony of gold leaf and ostentatious displays of wealth, the air thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfume and the low, rumbling machismo of dangerous men. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a web of false smiles and veiled threats woven between the two families who sat across from each other at a long, ornate table. Dante was a portrait of calm, lethal grace amidst the gaudy opulence, his quiet presence a black hole of power that seemed to suck the very light and noise from his immediate vicinity. I sat beside him, my posture rigid, my hands clasped tightly in my lap beneath the table, focusing all my energy on appearing serene and untouchable, a perfect, placid statue of a woman. The head of the rival family, a man named Marco Falcone, whose expensive suit could not disguise the predatory slime in his eyes or the cruel set of his mouth, made a show of ignoring me for the first part of the meal, a deliberate and calculated insult aimed at Dante. Then, as the main course was being served, Marco turned his oily gaze upon me, his smile a reptilian slash in his fleshy face. He was testing Dante, probing for a weakness by prodding at his new, mysterious possession. "A terrible tragedy. What happened to your family's business?" he said, his voice dripping with a thick, false sympathy that was more insulting than any open hostility. "Your father was a good man, but perhaps not suited for the realities of our world. An unfortunate decline." The words were a direct hit, a public broadcasting of my family's ruin, and, by extension, my own status as a piece of property paid in settlement of that debt. A hot, furious shame washed over me, but beneath it, something else stirred. A spark of the fierce, protective pride I once had. The spirit of the girl who had managed a household and shielded her brother from the harsh realities of their father's failing fortunes. A primal instinct for survival, for self-preservation, ignited in the ashes of my fear. Dante's lesson from our first dinner, his strange, twisted lecture on the currency of authentic pain and the performance of weakness, echoed in my mind. Instead of cowering or looking to Dante for rescue as Marco undoubtedly expected, I lifted my chin and met his gaze directly, holding it until a flicker of surprise registered in his reptilian eyes. I allowed a small, cool smile to touch my lips, a gesture of calm defiance that I hoped belied the frantic hammering of my heart against my ribs. My voice, when I spoke, was steady and clear, carrying across the sudden lull in the table's conversation. "My father valued honor over profit, Mr. Falcone," I said, my tone polite but laced with an undeniable edge of ice. A concept some men find tragically incomprehensible. The insult was subtle. A stiletto slipped between the ribs rather than a cudgel to the head. But its impact was immediate and profound. The table fell into a stunned silence, the air suddenly thick and heavy. Marco Falcone's face darkened, a flush of angry blood rising in his cheeks. From beside me, I did not need to look to feel the sudden, intense shift in Dante's attention. I felt his eyes on me, a physical touch, a burning brand of focus that was entirely different from the cold, analytical gaze I was used to. It was a look of genuine surprise, of sharp, sudden reevaluation. In that moment, I had ceased to be a simple, decorative object on his arm. I had become something else, something unexpected and far more interesting. I had become a weapon. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in a new and unfamiliar kind of silence, a stark departure from the victor's quiet that had followed our first dinner, and a world away from the empty, sterile voids that typically filled the space between us. This silence was not empty. It was dense and charged, a living entity that crackled with the leftover adrenaline of the confrontation and hummed with a nascent, dangerous energy that seemed to emanate directly from the man sitting beside me. Dante did not look at me, keeping his gaze fixed on the stream of city lights flowing past the windows. Yet I felt the full weight of his attention, a palpable force that was both unnerving and strangely intoxicating. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, the echo of my audacity at the dinner table reverberating through me, a reckless act of self-preservation that I now knew could have just as easily signed my death warrant as earned his approval. I had taken a tremendous risk, stepping out of the carefully prescribed role of a silent, beautiful possession and speaking in a den of wolves, and now, in the suspended animation of this journey back to his fortress, I could do nothing but wait for the verdict to be delivered. Upon arriving, he did not dismiss me to my room as he usually did, but instead gestured for me to follow him into his private study, the same room from which I had heard the sickening sounds of violence just days before. The heavy door closed behind us with a soft, ominous click, sealing us in a world of polished mahogany, the scent of old leather, and the faint, metallic tang of his power. The room was his throne room, his inner sanctum. But tonight, he broke the established ritual of our dynamic. He did not move to sit behind the massive, imposing desk that served as a barrier and a symbol of his authority. Instead, he walked to a crystal decanter on a nearby sideboard, the amber liquid glinting like liquid gold as he poured 2 generous measures of brandy into heavy snifters. The only sound in the room, the musical splash of the liquor. He turned and handed one of the glasses to me, his fingers brushing mine for a fleeting, electric moment. A simple point of contact that sent a jolt of heat racing up my arm. He stood before me, less than an arm's length away, effectively trapping me between his body and the cold, unyielding wood of the door, completely shattering the careful distance he had always maintained between us. "You have fire, Golubka," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that was somehow more commanding than any shout, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. I did not expect that. His words were a quiet acknowledgement of my performance, a confirmation that I had not just surprised him, but intrigued him, a dangerous and exhilarating realization. I had passed his unspoken test, proving that I was more than just a pretty face to adorn his arm, that I possessed a core of steel he had not previously detected. But the faint glimmer of pride that sparked within me was immediately extinguished by what came next, for I saw the shift in his eyes, the softening of his expression giving way to the focused, predatory gleam of a hunter who has successfully cornered his prey and is now moving in for the kill. He had praised my strength, but it was not a gift. It was the payment I had just made for the next stage of his interrogation. "Now," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, a velvet rasp that vibrated through the small space separating us. "No more pieces? I want the whole story." He took a slow, deliberate step closer, his presence so overwhelming that I felt the irrational urge to flatten myself against the door behind me. The scent of him, of brandy and clean linen, and something uniquely, dangerously masculine, filled my senses, clouding my thoughts. "The person you lost," he stated, the words not a question but a final, irrefutable accusation. "It was your brother, Leo." My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, painful gasp. "He was killed in a warehouse fire, a fire set by the very men your father owed money to." "The men," he paused, letting the weight of his final words land with the force of a physical blow, that I later absorbed into my organization when I took over their territory. The words struck me with the force of a physical assault, knocking the air from my lungs and shattering the last of my pathetic, carefully guarded defenses. He knew. He didn't just suspect or have pieces of the puzzle. He knew everything. The entire, sordid, heartbreaking story was laid bare between us, and the knowledge that this man, my captor, held the most painful secret of my life in his hands, was a violation so profound it left me trembling. There were no more lies to tell, no more deflections to attempt, no more shadows to hide in. The dam I had so painstakingly constructed around my grief, the one he had begun to crack at the restaurant, finally, catastrophically, broke. A sob tore its way from my throat, a raw, ragged sound of utter desolation, and the tears I had managed to suppress for so long began to fall, hot and fast and unstoppable. The story poured out of me in a torrent of broken words and choked sentences, a flood of pain and memory that I was powerless to control. I told him everything. I described Leo's laugh, a bright, infectious sound that could light up a room. I spoke of his ridiculous, ambitious dreams of becoming a world-famous architect, of the detailed, beautiful blueprints he would sketch for hours on end at the kitchen table. I recounted the acrid, clinging smell of smoke on my father's clothes the night he came home a broken man, the night he told us Leo was gone. It was a raw, ugly, cathartic confession, a final and complete act of surrender. I stood before him, completely and utterly vulnerable, my deepest, most sacred wound exposed to the one man who now owned every single part of my life, my past bleeding into my present right at his feet. My confession hung in the air between us, a raw and shimmering tapestry of my deepest anguish, each word a thread of pain that left me feeling hollowed out and utterly exposed in the suffocating stillness of his study. I was trembling, not from the cold, but from the violent, cathartic aftermath of unburdening a grief I had carried alone for so long, and I braced myself for the inevitable blow, the way he would now twist this intimate knowledge into a new and more potent weapon to wield against me. I fully expected him to file away the details of my brother's life and death, cataloging my vulnerabilities for future use, perhaps offering a cold, dismissive platitude about the harsh realities of life before sending me away, now more broken and more completely his than ever before. He was a monster, and monsters, I knew, fed on the pain of others, using their sorrows as leverage in their endless games of power and control. The silence stretched on, amplifying the sound of my ragged breaths and the frantic, terrified beating of my own heart. And in that terrible, suspended moment, I waited for the monster to show his teeth. But he did something else entirely, something so unexpected and profoundly disarming that it shattered all my preconceived notions of his cruelty, replacing them with a terrifying and far more complicated reality. He did not retreat behind the safety of his desk, nor did he dismiss me with a cold, cutting remark. Instead, he closed the small remaining distance between us, his movements fluid and deliberate, until he stood so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had settled deep within my bones. He raised his hand, not in a gesture of violence, but with a slow, almost hesitant grace, and his thumb, warm and slightly rough, came up to brush away a stray tear from my cheek. The simple, gentle touch, a shocking point of contact that sent a cascade of fire through my veins. It was the most intimate gesture I had experienced from anyone in years, and coming from him, my captor, it was a profound and bewildering contradiction that left me utterly frozen, unable to process the warring signals of tenderness and terror that were flooding my senses. He did not offer me the cheap, empty comfort of a sympathetic word or the insulting balm of pity. He offered me something far darker, something infinitely more potent and terrifyingly seductive. He offered me kinship. Leaning in closer, his lips near my ear, his voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial whisper, a sound meant only for me, a secret shared in the heart of his dark kingdom. "The first man I killed," he murmured, the words a raw, rasping confession that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of his soul, "was the man who murdered my father." His own story unfolded in the charged silence, a brutal counterpoint to my own tale of loss, a narrative steeped not in helpless grief, but in cold, calculated vengeance. He described finding his father's body, the betrayal of a trusted friend, and the icy, clarifying rage that had settled in his young heart, a rage that had burned away all traces of fear and boyhood innocence, leaving behind only the singular, driving purpose of retribution. He was not comforting me. He was mirroring me, showing me the reflection of my own grief in the shattered, blood-soaked pieces of his own past. He described hunting the man down, the grim satisfaction of the chase, and the final, brutal confrontation in a snow-dusted alleyway in a city whose name I did not catch. He spoke of the act itself not with remorse or with pride, but with a chilling, detached sense of cosmic rebalancing, as if he were an agent of some dark, immutable fate. When I watched the life leave his eyes, Dante continued, his thumb now tracing the line of my jaw, his touch both a caress and a claim, I did not feel guilt. I felt balance. I had put the world back on its axis. In this horrific, unholy sacrament of shared darkness, he was not trying to absolve me of my pain. He was validating it, legitimizing the ugly, vengeful thoughts that had festered in the hidden corners of my heart since Leo's death. He was showing me that he understood the brutal, primal language of grief and vengeance, a language that the civilized world pretends not to speak. He was anointing me in his own darkness, baptizing me in his worldview, and in doing so, he was irrevocably blurring the stark line between captor and captive, twisting it into something far more complex and terrifyingly intimate. The air in the room, already thick with my confession, became supercharged with a dangerous, erotic tension, an undeniable current of attraction that was as horrifying as it was irresistible. I was looking into the eyes of a killer, a monster who held my life in his hands, and yet, in this moment of shared, brutal honesty, I felt a terrifying sense of being truly seen for the first time. He did not recoil from the depths of my sorrow or the ugliness of my loss. He met me there, in that dark and desolate place, and showed me his own scars. He didn't kiss me. The moment was too raw, too sacred for something so simple. He just held my gaze, and in the dark, fathomless depths of his eyes, I saw the last of my resistance crumble and fall away. The dynamic between us had been irrevocably altered. I was no longer just a victim looking at her tormentor. I was a woman drowning in a grief that no one could understand, and I was looking at the only man on earth who had not offered me pity, but had instead offered me a crown and a throne in his own kingdom of pain. A week passed in a state of suspended reality, a strange, liminal space where the familiar parameters of my captivity had dissolved, leaving behind a quiet, humming tension that was both terrifying and electrifying. The dynamic between Dante and me had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted in the wake of our shared confessions in his study. The clear lines of captor and captive had blurred into a murky, intimate landscape, where we were no longer defined by our initial roles, but by the dark, secret truths we had shared. He was different with me now. The cold, analytical distance replaced by a watchful, possessive intensity that followed me through the long, silent hours in the penthouse. His gaze a physical touch that I felt even when his back was turned. I found myself caught in a disorienting paradox, simultaneously more afraid of him than ever before, for I had now seen the depths of the darkness he harbored, and yet also feeling a terrifying, magnetic pull towards that very same darkness. A moth drawn to a flame that promised both annihilation and a strange, profound sense of belonging. The world had shrunk to the confines of his gilded cage, and within it, a new and dangerous ecosystem was beginning to form, governed by unspoken rules and the powerful, gravitational force of his obsession with me. It was on a gray, rain-lashed afternoon that he finally summoned me, his voice over the apartment's intercom system, a calm, low command that nonetheless sent a jolt of anxious energy through me. I found him not in his study, the site of my emotional undoing, but in the vast, minimalist living area, where he stood silhouetted against the dramatic backdrop of the storm-ravaged city skyline, the rain tracing frantic, weeping patterns down the floor-to-ceiling glass. He was not dressed in one of his impeccably tailored suits, but in simple black trousers and a soft, dark cashmere sweater that seemed to absorb the bleak, ambient light, making him appear more like a shadowy wraith than a man of flesh and blood. On the low glass coffee table before him, placed with the deliberate, ceremonial precision of a sacrament on an altar, was a single, slim file folder, its stark manila color a jarring contrast to the monochromatic opulence of the room. It seemed to thrum with a latent, malevolent energy, a quiet harbinger of a truth I was not yet prepared to face. "Your father's debt," Dante began, his voice a quiet rumble that easily carried over the distant, muted roar of the storm, as he turned from the window to face me, his eyes dark and unreadable, "has been paid." He did not elaborate, nor did he need to. He simply gestured towards the coffee table with a subtle inclination of his head, a silent invitation to approach and bear witness. My feet felt like lead as I crossed the expanse of polished marble, each step a hesitant, reluctant beat in a funeral dirge, my heart hammering against my ribs with a premonition of what I was about to see. My hands trembled as I reached for the folder, the simple, flimsy cardboard feeling impossibly heavy, weighted with the gravity of lives and deaths and the terrible, final accounting of sins. I opened it, and the sterile, clinical contents within seemed to suck all the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping in the silent, storm-lit room. Inside, there were no legal documents, no contracts marked "paid in full," but a collection of glossy, high-resolution photographs, their brutal clarity offering no refuge in ambiguity. They were crime scene photos. The first was of a man I vaguely recognized from my father's anxious descriptions, his face a slack, surprised mask in death. A single dark bullet hole, a stark punctuation mark in the center of his forehead. The next photo was of another man, his body contorted at an unnatural angle beside a luxury car, the pristine chrome of the bumper spattered with a spray of his blood. There were 4 men in total, each one captured in the final, ignominious moment of their existence. Their reign of casual cruelty and predatory lending brought to an abrupt and violent end. He had hunted them down, these ghosts who had haunted my family's ruin, these faceless architects of my brother's death, and he had systematically, ruthlessly exterminated them. He had done it for me. This was not business. This was a gift, a dark and bloody tribute laid at my feet. A wave of profound, sickening nausea rose in my throat, my mind reeling from the graphic, undeniable finality of the images before me. But it was immediately followed by a dark, terrible, and shamefully potent surge of relief. It was a feeling so powerful and so primal it momentarily eclipsed the horror, a deeply buried, vengeful part of my soul roaring its approval. The weight of helpless grief and impotent rage that I had carried for so long seemed to lift, replaced by the grim, chilling satisfaction of a debt paid in blood. He had not just listened to my pain. He had taken it, absorbed it, and transmuted it into a violent, definitive act of retribution. He had stained his hands with the blood of my enemies to soothe the wound in my soul. This act, this terrible, magnificent gesture, bound me to him in a way that no contract, no threat, no act of possession ever could. I was no longer just a victim of circumstance, a pawn in the games of powerful men. I was now a beneficiary of their violence, a willing recipient of a vengeance I had secretly craved but never dared to voice. I looked up from the grisly photographs and met his watchful, waiting gaze, and in that moment, I saw the devil, and for the first time in my life, I was not afraid. I was complicit. The aftermath of Dante's bloody gift was a silent, creeping poison that seeped into every corner of my existence, fundamentally altering the very chemical composition of the air I breathed within the confines of the penthouse. The photographs in the manila folder became a spectral presence in my mind, a collection of ghosts that both haunted and soothed me, their gruesome finality a constant, visceral reminder of the terrible pact that had been sealed between my captor and me. I found myself trapped in a chaotic, disorienting maelstrom of conflicting emotions, my soul a battlefield where horror and gratitude waged a relentless, bloody war. One moment, I would be consumed by a wave of revulsion so profound it made my stomach churn, picturing the cold, efficient brutality of the acts he had committed in my name, seeing myself as an accomplice to murder, my hands metaphorically stained with the same blood that was on his. In the next moment, however, a dark, treacherous sense of vindication would rise within me, a savage whisper that celebrated the justice, however barbaric, that had been meted out to the men who had destroyed my family and stolen my brother's future. A whisper that shamefully, secretly, thanked Dante for being the monster I could never be. This internal schism, this violent tearing of my own moral fabric, was a form of madness, and it left me feeling fractured and untethered from the person I once believed myself to be. The last vestiges of my resistance, the defiant, frightened girl who had sat across from him in that restaurant, had been systematically dismantled, not by overt threats or physical force, but by this single, devastating act of twisted empathy. He had not broken my will. He had seduced it, luring it into a dark allegiance with his own violent code, proving to me that his world of brutal, decisive action could achieve a finality that my world of civilized grief never could. The tension that had been a simmering, subterranean current between us since that first night now rose to the surface, a palpable, suffocating heat that charged every glance, every accidental touch, every shared silence, transforming the vast, sterile apartment into a pressure cooker of unspoken desire and forbidden need. I could no longer look at him without seeing both the devil who had claimed me and the dark angel who had avenged me, a terrifying and irresistible duality that drew me in even as it repelled me. My nights became a landscape of restless, feverish dreams, my subconscious mind a canvas for the war raging within me, where images of Leo's smiling face would dissolve into the lifeless eyes of the men in the photographs, their silent accusations merging with a phantom echo of Dante's possessive whisper. I would wake up in the dead of night, my body slick with a cold sweat, my heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs, the silence of my luxurious prison amplifying the roar of my inner turmoil. I was drowning, sinking into a moral abyss of his creation, and the most terrifying part was the small, treacherous part of me that was no longer fighting the current, the part of me that was beginning to find a strange, perverse comfort in the depths. He seemed to sense the change in me, the final, chaotic surrender of my soul, for his watchfulness intensified, his dark eyes following me with a knowing, patient hunger that stripped away my last defenses, making me feel as transparent as the glass walls that surrounded us. He was waiting for me to make the final move, to cross the last threshold, to not just accept my fate, but to actively, willingly choose it. The breaking point came on a quiet, moonless night, the city lights below a distant, indifferent galaxy. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, a perfect vacuum that offered no distraction from the storm raging within me. I stood before the mirror in my room, staring at the reflection of a woman I no longer recognized, a woman whose eyes held a haunted, feverish glow, a woman who had been hollowed out and refilled with a dark and potent cocktail of grief, vengeance, and a terrifying, all-consuming desire. The choice, I realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, was not between good and evil, or between freedom and captivity, for those concepts had lost all meaning in this gilded cage. The only choice left was between a slow, agonizing descent into solitary madness, or a final, complete surrender to the one person on earth who not only understood the darkness inside me, but had also mirrored it, validated it, and ultimately, weaponized it for my sake. It was a choice between dying alone in the dark or learning to live in his shadows. With a resolve born of desperation and a strange, newfound sense of purpose, I left my room, my bare feet silent on the cold marble floor as I walked the long, shadowed hallway towards his chambers. Every step was a conscious decision, a deliberate shedding of the person I used to be, a final, irrevocable stride into the heart of the storm. The heavy wooden door to his bedroom was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm, low light spilling into the hallway. A silent invitation that felt as though it had been waiting for me all along. Pushing the door open, I found him standing by the vast window, much like he had been on the day he'd shown me the file. A dark, solitary figure staring out at his kingdom. He turned as I entered, his expression unreadable in the dim light. But I saw no surprise in his eyes, only a deep, knowing stillness, the quiet satisfaction of a predator whose prey has finally, willingly, walked into its den. I stopped in the center of the room, the space between us humming with a lifetime of unspoken words and unshed tears, the culmination of every interrogation, every confession, every act of violence and vengeance. I did not speak. I did not need to. My presence here was a confession in itself, a final, unconditional surrender. And in his dark, possessive eyes, I saw not the triumph of a captor, but the profound, solemn recognition of a king who has just found his queen. Our collision that night was not the soft, tender union of lovers, but a violent, elemental storm, a cataclysmic event that felt as though it had been gathering force since the moment I first sat across from him, a prisoner at his table. It was the physical consummation of the brutal, intimate war we had been waging for months, a clash of his unyielding power and my defiant pain, a desperate, frenzied battle for control that ended in the only way it ever could, in a complete and mutual surrender. In his arms, against the cool, crisp sheets of his bed, with the glittering, indifferent city spread out beneath us like a fallen constellation, I was not a prisoner being taken, but a survivor finally finding a savage, turbulent sanctuary in the very heart of the hurricane that had consumed my life. Every touch was a brand, every kiss a claim, a violent, desperate rewriting of our history, transforming the dynamics of captor and captive into a far more complex and terrifying alchemy of possession and worship. We were two fractured halves of a single dark soul, and in the raw, primal crucible of that night, we were finally, violently, forged into one. The world that greeted me the next morning, and in all the mornings that followed, was fundamentally altered, a landscape repainted in the stark, vivid colors of my new reality. The final chapter of my story found me seated once again in a restaurant, a deliberate and symbolic return to the battlefield where my old self had fought its last stand. We were in a different establishment this time, one even more exclusive and opulent. But the ghost of that first night was a palpable presence, a silent third guest at our table. Everything was different, yet hauntingly the same. I was no longer seated at the far end of the table, an isolated subject under his scrutinizing gaze, but beside him, our chairs so close that his thigh pressed against mine, a constant, possessive point of contact that grounded me in this new world. I wore a dress of black silk that he had chosen, a garment that felt less like a costume and more like a uniform, and at the base of my throat, where a single tear had once betrayed me, rested a collar of brilliant, cold diamonds, a piece that was simultaneously a lavish gift and an unbreakable leash, a beautiful, glittering symbol of my willing subjugation. I was no longer his prisoner, not in the simple sense of the word. I had been elevated to something far more dangerous, far more powerful. I was his queen. I saw it in the way the maitre d' now met my eyes with the same fearful deference he reserved for Dante, in the way the waiters anticipated my needs with a silent, nervous efficiency. The men in his organization, those dangerous figures with violence simmering just beneath the surface of their expensive suits, now regarded me with a wary, calculated respect, for they had witnessed the totality of his obsession with me, and they understood that my whisper could easily become his command, my displeasure his wrath. I had become the keeper of the king's secrets, the one person who had been granted access to the well of darkness within him, and in that shared intimacy, I had found a terrifying, exhilarating new form of power. I moved through his world not as a captive, but as a shadow monarch, my influence subtle but absolute, my throne situated securely in the dark, protected kingdom of his heart. As the impeccably orchestrated meal drew to its close, the waiter clearing away the last of the dessert plates with practiced, reverent hands, a fleeting, bittersweet memory of Leo ambushed me, a ghost of his easy laughter in a world that now seemed so devoid of such simple joys. It was not a moment of profound grief, just a quiet, melancholic echo from another life, but it was enough to cause the serene, carefully composed smile on my face to falter for the briefest of moments, a microscopic crack in the flawless facade of the queen. It was a flicker so infinitesimal that anyone else would have missed it, but Dante, my ever-watchful, ever-present king, missed nothing. He saw it instantly, his dark eyes narrowing with that familiar, intense focus, the way a hawk tracks the slightest flutter of a wing. He leaned in close, his movement a fluid, predatory grace, his lips brushing against the sensitive shell of my ear, his warm breath a ghost against my skin. His voice, when it came, was a low, possessive murmur, a secret language meant only for me, the very same words that had once been a command, a weapon, a demand for my soul. "Tell me why you cried." But this time, the words were not a demand. They were not a threat or an interrogation. They were an intimacy, a lover's right, a soft, possessive reminder of the journey we had taken. From a girl who wept in secret to a woman who now ruled beside him. They were the 3 words that had begun my undoing and had ultimately led to my remaking. I turned my head slowly to face him, the diamond collar cold against my skin, and allowed a slow, knowing smile to grace my lips, a smile that held all the secrets of our shared darkness, all the ghosts of the men he had killed for me, all the fire of the woman I had become in his flames. I was no longer the girl who cried. I was the woman who would watch the world burn for this man, my captor, my avenger, my king. And as I looked into the endless, dark depths of his eyes, I opened my mouth to answer, ready to give him this piece of me, and every other piece he would ever ask for, freely and forever.